basically that was it in a nutshell.
Yeah, one of the very first managers you'll have worked with would have been Roy Keane. I'm just intrigued to know, from your perspective as a reporter, was he difficult to interview with his personality?
Well, it's funny because the first manager I actually worked with was Mick McCarthy. So I had a couple of years with Mick McCarthy before Roy Keane. But to answer your Roy Keane question, no, he was absolute joy to interview. I think we all had trepidation when we knew the night that Niall Quinn at Bury dropped the bombshell that a world-class manager was coming in. So everyone was immediately eyeing up world-class managers, and Roy Keane, that his name didn't even enter anybody's heads because he'd never managed before. But a week later, it transpired it was Roy. So I think there was a lot of trepidation because we all knew of Roy's reputation. But as soon as he arrived, and when we first started to interview him, you knew it was gold dust. Really, it was a pleasure to interview. You had to be on your toes because he's very, very sharp. He's very bright. He would test you. I think he was very aware that if you didn't know your stuff, he'd soon pick up on it. So you had to prepare. You couldn't just sort of blindly going into an interview first thing in the morning, because he used to hold his press conference first thing in the morning, 8:45, and he was always on time, a stickler for time. You couldn't just breeze in and muddle your way through an interview. You had to know what you were talking about. He would pick you up very smartly if you felt that you had got something wrong or you didn't know what you were talking about. But he was very, very good. He always said right from the start, if you show me respect, I'll show you respect. And I think that was important. I think that's something that I think throughout my career as a sports reporter, journalist, I think it's an important mantra, if you like. I think if you do show managers and players respect, you'll get that respect in return, and it pays dividends in the long run. And I think it's quite important. But Roy Keane certainly, he worked by that tenet. He was very sort of he was professional. I mean, the professionalism slipped towards the end when it was all going a bit awry. Then it started to fragment, if you like, and you had a real sense that the time was coming, his time was coming to an end. But if you talk to any journalists or any reporters that covered Sunderland when Roy Keane was a manager, was the manager, I think all of them, to every single one of them, would tell you how much they enjoyed covering the club when Roy was manager.
Yeah, definitely. Out of all the managers and players who you have worked with, like a lot now, is there anyone who has been difficult to interview or hasn't made things easy for you?
David Moyes, Ruud Gullit and David Moyes. I mean, Ruud Gullit at Newcastle was just impossible really to deal with. Just had this arrogance, and I think that was something that was in part led to his. It just wasn't going to work out for Ruud Gullit because of a number of reasons. Not was he only just arrogant with the media. Right? He was clearly arrogant when it came to the players as well. And that was his undoing. But David Moyes at Sunderland was an extraordinary sort of enigma. It was a bit of a paradox, really, because when you spoke to David Moyes off the record and when the microphones weren't on, couldn't have been nicer. Just, you could have a really good conversation with him. As soon as the microphone was switched on, he was a completely different animal, sort of passive aggressive and really not a nice person to deal with. And I found that difficult. He was a very intimidating manager to interview. And as I say, there's this paradox because as soon as the microphone was off, he was absolutely fine. So whether it was something he sort of engineered over the years to try and intimidate journalists, I don't know, but it's something that I wasn't comfortable with. I didn't enjoy it. I certainly didn't lose any sleep when he lost the job or when he left.
Neither did I.
Well, I think most people. And so, I think he's been at Sunderland, of all the managers, he's really been the only one that has been difficult. Phil Parkinson in his last few months, I think this season, whilst he wasn't difficult, when we had a bit of a run-in right at the start of the season in pre-season, and it sort of coloured the way our relationship went for the rest of this season. And again, it wasn't wasn't easy. It wasn't comfortable. I think, like most people, I think we saw the writing on the wall with Phil. I mean, again, when you spoke to Phil Parkinson without the microphones, fine. Nice guy. I mean, don't get me wrong. I mean, he's a good bloke. He's a nice bloke. But the way the football was going, the way the relationship developed this season because of the football, he became a bit prickly, a bit difficult to interview. So I didn't lose too much sleep when he left as well. But those two really. But I mean, David Moyes and Phil Parkinson were a long way apart in terms of difficulty. Whilst I say there was a problem with Phil Parkinson, nothing compared to the difficulties in trying to interview David Moyes.
So do you just think that Phil Parkinson was difficult to interview because the football was going a little bit sour at the time, and I think squad morale was a little bit low, and he maybe just wasn't quite thriving himself in his job, and he didn't take kindly to the media when he felt as if he had like enough on his.
Well, I think he realised. I mean, it's funny because the season before, Jack Ross, I think there was a sense when his second season started, he wasn't as comfortable in his own skin as he'd been the previous season. You could reading, you get an intuition because you deal with the managers so much. You have so much sort of contact with them. You could get a feeling with Jack at the beginning of that season. It wasn't the same Jack Ross as we've been dealing with the previous season. And likewise, Phil Parkinson at the start of this season just got a sense that something wasn't quite right. And as the season unfolded, I think that became much clearer in the dealing, for instance, the Aidan McGeady issue, the sort of rigidity of his tactics, his sort of steadfast sort of refusal to make substitutions till late in the game. So many little things that basically conspired to give away, I think, to us that things weren't right. And you could even sense when you were talking to him that there was there was a tenseness, that wasn't there before. I mean, there's much when you're interviewing managers and when you do it week in, week out, you really need that. It needs to be relaxed. You need to be in an environment where you feel you can ask just about anything, really. But when it gets to the point where you feel that there are questions that you need to ask, but you can't ask because the reaction is going to be negative, then you know that something's wrong. And I think that was very much the case with Phil Parkinson's. Interesting because we always get lots of fans saying, why don't you ask this? Why don't you ask that? But people forget that you're working with these people, week in, week out, sometimes 2, 3, 4 times a week. You've got to have a relationship with them because if you don't, you get nothing from them. This is the big thing. People say, why don't you ask those questions? Because if you ask those questions, you'll get blanked out completely. You'll get a yes, no answer, and you won't get anything from them from there on in. Your relationship breaks down. You've got to maintain some sort of relationship. If you don't, there's no interview, full stop. And, our whole business is built around audio interviews. And if you fall out with a manager, you get no audio, you get no interviews. So I think people have got to realize that, we've got a job to do. And part of that job is maintaining a relationship, however good or however bad it might be, with a manager. But at the end of the day, my bosses expect me to come back with an interview. I can't come back to my boss and say, he wouldn't talk to me this week. That's just not good enough. So, that's the sort of thing that's one of those sort of something that happens behind the scenes, if you like, which people never get to see, but it's a very, very important part of the job. And, it's vital that you maintain some sort of relationship with managers and players.
Do you think that sometimes managers and players have a preconception of the media to think that when they're getting asked questions, it's quite deceitful, and that can maybe cause them to have their guard because they feel as if almost they're getting asked questions to be tripped up, to be exposed, so you get that clip and that could be used to get views because it's a common thing in the media, I think, especially in newspapers rather, where the questions will be asked just to get titles out of them and things like that.
No, there's an element of that. Mick McCarthy always used to say he didn't mind doing radio interviews because he felt they couldn't be edited, they couldn't be misconstrued, which is a myth because of course they can be. and he didn't trust newspapers because he said that they would always twist his words and write what they wanted to write rather than what he wanted to say. But I think it works on two levels. I think there's the national level where national newspapers and media do tend to be looking for a line, if you like. That's the sort of phrase. Mick McCarthy always. There was once it was with Graham Anderson, the Sunderland Echo's reporter at the time, and he let slip something, and suddenly Mick pulled back. He said, "Oh no, I've given you a line. I've given you a line." He was horrified because he'd given Graham a snippet, which he hadn't meant to give him. But so national newspapers, national media do tend to be looking for a line, whereas local media, we've got our interests are more deep rooted than the stories that they're looking for. And I think that's one of the important things that local media, we try to build up a relationship with a manager, and I think the club knows that, the managers know that. It's a two-way street, and it's a trust thing, and there's very much you do try and build a trust between you and the manager, and it works both ways. They trust us to report fairly and be objective when it comes to the reporting of the football club, but at the same time they will give you off the record. They will tell us that very often sort of snippets about what the team will be, who's injured, or what the true story behind an incident was, on the trust that you won't report that, because they don't actually necessarily want that to be in the public domain. Although so much gets out now, there's not much that doesn't really get out into the public domain. But so it's on, coming back to that point, it's on two levels. We're currently trying to build a relationship with Lee Johnson, and he's very good. I mean, he does, he will, for instance, before a Tuesday night game, just speak to me, James, and Phil on the Echo and the Cron, because it's all part of building up a relationship, which is hard at the moment because of the pandemic. Most of the stuff's done on Zoom, and that's difficult. We haven't got that face-to-face relationship, which is so important. But that's a lot of work in so many ways. A lot of work is done, but away from the public glare and gaze, because these things take time, and they take a lot of legwork, if you like, to build up. I mean, it's so frustrating with Sunderland's managers only lasting about a year, because just as you get a relationship with them, they get sacked, and you have to start all over again, and it can take 3-4 months to build trust. And within months after that, the manager's gone, which is difficult.
Yeah, you touched on Lee Johnson now. I was gonna be, my next question is how have you found him? I guess my perception is that he talks very well. He's very open and honest. He's very transparent, and he seems to have he seems to almost want to communicate with the fans through the media, in a sense. When the few times I've watched an interview of him, is that something you would agree with?
Yeah, he is very good. He is very good. He's a good talker. I think he very much appreciates the relationship between him and the fans and the media is important. I think he's very much a football man. I think I think he sees. It was interesting conversation I had with him the other day. He very much sees the media as, you report. We're the professionals. We as footballers, as a football manager, I'm the man who knows all about football. You are the media, and I'll tell you what you need to know and be very open. But there is a divide, very telling divide actually, which should be interesting over the next few months to see how the relationship develops. But thus far, he's been very good, and I'm sort of embracing that. And as I say, and this is in times when it's not very easy to build a relationship, because I'm only seeing him on Zoom before a game. I'm only seeing him in the flesh at the Stadium of Light after a game. I'm not seeing him after away games now. So building a relationship is much, much harder. And it's going to take a lot longer, I think, for it to develop between Lee Johnson, myself, and Phil and James, and hopefully, come Easter we start to get back to some sort of normality, because in the past, before a game when we have our press conferences, you could often sit down for an hour or so with the manager and chat off the record, and they were very important times, because that's when you really started to get to know each other, and we just haven't got that in a minute. It's just not there at the moment, and it's an important part of the job.
Yeah, it's maybe a part of the job that doesn't get seen or thought as much by the public eye, because it has to be done behind closed doors, and that's the point of it, really, is to get to know those people. I think your favourite player, didn't you? I think it was Bolo Zenden. But
yeah, he's very good.
Yeah. Out of all the managers, who's been your favourite to work with?
Well, I mean, Roy Keane, was up there. I mean, just because it was fantastic. It wasn't verbal jousting, but it was very, it was just like he was very articulate. He was very knowledgeable. He was very intelligent, and you could have a very good conversation with him. The interviews were very, very good. They were actually enjoyable to do. Martin O'Neill as a manager was great. More his off the record, when we used to sit down with Martin and talk football and music and literature and the law and everything else. I mean, Martin O'Neill is an absolutely fascinating character. So him, it was more off the record than the interviews. Steve Bruce, love him or loathe him, he was brilliant to deal with.
I thought he was just a
very, very, very personable. He's just a nice guy, and it's hard watching the what he's going through at Newcastle at the minute. I do feel for him. I understand where the fans are coming from, but at the same time, having worked with Steve Bruce, having spent a few years with him, got to know him really well, I do feel sorry for him. I think it's wretched when you see any manager, any individual actually go through what he's going through at Newcastle at the minute. So I have some sympathy for him. And as I say, at Sunderland, he was a pleasure to deal with, and I couldn't in any shape or form complain about Steve. He was open, he was honest, he was trustful. You could phone him. He would always give me the team on the match day, and so on. And you could phone him anytime, and he would chat and be very open. So he was very good. I mean, there are very few managers that didn't. Paolo Di Canio was just an enigma anyway. So nobody had a relationship with Paolo Di Canio. It was just he was a tornado that blew through the club, basically. Gus Poyet, I got on fine with. Again, I enjoyed interviewing him. Enjoyed talking to him off the record. Dick Advocat, lovely man, wonderful to deal with. There's very, very few. As I say, David Moyes, Phil Parkinson, at Sunderland that were not necessarily of that ilk. The rest of them, absolutely no complaints, and clearly some more favourable than others in the sense of dealing with them. But Roy Keane would be up there at the top, definitely.
Yeah, interesting to hear that Keane was at the top. He's just such a character. I wouldn't know if it would maybe it would intimidate some people, I guess.
Yeah, he did, and he knew he did. I mean, he made a point of doing so at away games, especially. He used to. I think he actually thrived on walking into a press room after an away game and knowing that most of the press in there didn't know him and were terrified of him, and he played up to that. And he teased people in that respect, and I think he thoroughly enjoyed doing it. It was interesting, but when you knew him. If you asked the first question and he didn't like it, he would stare at you and ask a question back, and it was a test, to see how you'd react. But knowing him week in, week out, you knew how to react. You had to come back. You had to come back at him with another question or the right answer, and if you did that, you were absolutely fine. So we knew that. We worked with him week in, week out, and knew how he ticked. But reporters at away games didn't, and tended to. It led to some interesting scenarios where there are a few fallouts and a few, angry words and so on. But Roy loved that. I mean, he played up to it. That was just part of his character. He was mischievous. I mean, there was a mischievous side. There is a mischievous side to Roy Keane. There's a very humorous side to him as well. He's a very funny guy. I mean, off the record, he was, he was often cracking jokes. He was one of those that cracked jokes and laughed at his own jokes. But he was that was part of his charm, if you like. Part of the pleasure of sort of dealing with him, and another part of that pleasure was watching how he related, his interaction with reporters at away games became almost an entertainment for us. So there were a lot of aspects to Roy Keane.